Thanks for inviting me. I started dealing with books during my studies, actually. I studied conceptual art and stage design in relation to sculpture work, and I realized very often while I was working or finishing a certain piece that there were documents left over which were not the work itself, but they were somehow the only thing which was there. And so I started to rethink how to deal with documents like this, how to make it possible to communicate my own interest in art, and how could I, maybe find my own way how to deal with this phenomenon I experienced. And so I started making books, and as you know, publications has been always something which were produced next to the artwork. So the fact that you were focusing on text or on a publication were not really the thing a gallery or a curator were looking for. At the time when I started, I was studying in the mid of the 90s. So anyway, but I think publishing is basically a consequence of concept art which started in the 60s or maybe even earlier, already in the 20s when you think of Marcel Duchamp. And so in that case, I had the feeling in relation to the new media which started about this time, that it would be a good idea to focus on a media which is actually not in focus at all. It has changed, as we know. It became a real boom, and nowadays we can say that after the internet became a mass media, the book was empty, and the art world, or the artists, but not only artists, also people like combinations, groups of people, graphic designers, writers, curators. Everyone was starting to rethink a book as a medium to use to communicate certain interests. That's actually how I started.
And so also like your interest, it's not, hello, no, it comes and goes. It's interesting that you make artist books, but you're also interested in books, artist books made by others. It's nice to see like how you work with other people's books. So this between your own individual bookmaking practice and your interest in other books, so we can in a more collective way. Maybe you can tell us more, and we can talk about Salon für Kunst.
So my interest started from the beginning, actually, to look also at and in 2007, maybe that's more better to understand. In 2007, I decided to change my studio into a model of a bookstore, which meant to me that I emptied the whole space. I painted it in gray. You will see some images here in the back. This is a 3D scan from the studio after 5 years. And at the beginning, I had no publications in at all, but I told myself to focus on one aspect or one physical moment, the book as an object, but also the book as a medium we have been using for 600 years. We have been developing. It became our own culture. It became the way how we were actually discussing, but also describing life in general. And so I was starting to collect publications. I opened my studio with kind of opening hours, and I tried to involve other artists, writers, critics, but also curators and people who came from art theory or art history inside this laboratory. So you could say normally a studio is always a kind of laboratory in which you try to find out things. So I collected books, and after a while, people thought it's a kind of bookstore because there were a possibility to bring books, but to look at books, but also to buy some of them. I set up certain rules because I wasn't interested to sell all of it. But the selling point was important for me because I didn't want to become an exhibition space, what we call an off space, or a gallery or a bookstore, but also not a library. So I created a kind of hybrid in between, which I tried to fill up with all kinds of informations from all over. So I was also traveling, meeting people, doing a research on the relation between book and different interests as an artist. And well, I ended up creating a kind of environment in which people could experience the multitude of publishing, which actually means the multitude of artistic production. So there is a lot of different expressions, but there is never a lot of copies. I'm using, just because of the images, I'm using often 3D scans for a space, because this space doesn't exist anymore. So to save a certain situation and to make it possible to revisit it in a different way.
So maybe my question is on this physicality of the bookshop, of the book, the Salon for Kunstbuch, or your project that becomes like this bookshop / library. I mean, your project, it's like a sculpture, a library that becomes a sculpture, or it's like this collection of books that becomes a sculpture sometimes, and sometimes it's scanned, and sometimes it's reproduced as textiles. And so, like, maybe you tell us about when you are not in your studio and you're invited as an artist to go to other places and present or put together artworks, or put together like a presentation of sorts. How do you deal with this impossibility of carrying the physical thing and producing, or maybe, just tell us, how do you take your project outside your own studio?
Well, basically for me, there is always a relation between the object, which in that case is the book, and the space. So I really like to deal with space in itself. I was always building furnitures for spaces, and I was always interested in how people actually can experience those kind of publications in a different way by creating a certain environment. I made this experience like in 2011, the Austrian Belvedere, which is an institution, art institution in Vienna, they became interested in the piece because they reopened an exhibition space, and they were looking for something which is not a shop in a traditional way. Maybe you know, museum shops, they have a certain function. They are kind of important for institutions also to show what they do. But the director of the Belvedere, she was interested in to get something different, a new step, and she said in the 21st century we would like to try a step forward. So they asked me to install this kind of installation and to rethink my studio work and to transfer it or transform it into something which works inside an art institution.
So what you transported to the museum is basically the hybrid form, which is a bookshop that used to be a bookshop but not a bookshop, your studio but not a studio, or a private space but also a public space. This installation that you created in your studio, you transported this to the museum, right?
Not in a physical way, because the institution had a certain architectural expression. There were no walls. Everything was made out of glass. And it was an interesting building, so I created a kind of 12-meter long wall, which I put in the middle of the space, and I created small islands in which you could actually look at publications, sit or stand, or look in a vitrine, or look to the wall, things like that.
So visitors would use it as a library, but they can also still buy maybe. But also you were organizing like a public program. So who were you inviting to this place?
Well, basically I started in this space with 0 books, like in my studio, and then it became interesting for a lot of artists in Vienna because it's a very noticed place, so people come there, and so they wanted to present their own work in terms of showing their catalogs, their publications. So I was starting to collect, and were bringing my own rules into this situation, which also created an interesting conversation between people who are used to buy things and people who are realize that they can't. But it was then later on I started doing exhibitions in the space, doing talks. We had, like for 6 years, we had every second week a presentation of a publication. So you can imagine this became very intense. And I tried to use this opportunity of the space. It was about 200 square meters in the institution to make my own interest in the medium public, but not only mine, but also the relations with a lot of other people. Because what you do basically when you look at books, especially art and artist books, you start looking at the meaning of what the book is about, and then you start discussing. So it's a very good opportunity to discuss artistic questions by looking at publications. That's what we do anyway.
And I think with this also movement outside your studio comes with like when you are in new spaces and you are receiving books, or you are arriving at a place where maybe you are there also to understand what sort of books can also come to you from these new spaces. It was interesting when we first worked together. You said I work with certain, like you have a set of colors that you work with, and you have these theories and new ideas or like your own ideas, let's say, of how do you organize a like books on shelves, or according to color, and or like sometimes how you were also collecting books that are on drawings. And so maybe you tell us also maybe on this, like being prepared to receive as many publications that can be as different as they come, and also find ways to show these very small objects, in such always like sculptural interventions in exhibitions or events.
Well, when I started in 2007, I used, after I finished my studies, I mixed my own colors in a form that I decided to work in the future in a certain way, that I'm not trying to find a color every time I'm trying to do something, instead of using colors I really like. And so I have a color range of blue, I have a color range of gray, of red, of green, of a lot of different colors. It sounds simple, but for me it was a good opportunity to go back every time I have to work on something. I'm just using my own color code. And in relation to books, I started after 1,000 books, collecting 1,000 books. I started color coding because I was interested in the impression. What does it do if we only show red books in a block? Maybe you saw one of the images. There's one image where you see red and white books. So I thought it was interesting for me to see also the relations. When you do books as an artist, you choose colors for specific reasons, and so every book looks different, because very often the artists are doing the graphic design or the way how it looks themselves. They work very close together with graphic designers and printers. So then every book looks different. It's not like a publishing house which has a certain line and then you have maybe different colors, but it's creating a different expression. And by bringing those publications in color orders, you create a new experience. And I was quite surprised, because some people told me, of course my colleagues told me, some of them, okay, it's a bit weird, why do you sort by color, this has no meaning. But then other people told me, okay, looks completely new to me. I had never have been looking at so many yellow books at one time, and it creates a certain impression and a different interest, because you get, you like to, you have first of all, you have an aesthetic impression, and second, this makes you get closer and try to find out. And I kind of like this way of work in which you experiment also with the material. So I'm using those publications for new works. I don't change them in terms of, cutting them or taking pages out. I never do that, but I like to use them for installations.
Well, maybe we talk about the two works in the exhibition. So there's the project, we can start with the No ISBN. So how did it start, this project?
Well, in 2009, I did a kind of poster performance at the PS1 in New York. And this was actually only meant as an expression of what I had in mind. So I had about 400 posters glued on cardboards and were using them for this performance. And then a lot of people took photos of these posters, and on the poster was written, there will be one image here where you can see it. It was written no ISBN. What was the text? I don't remember. It was an open submission for art books. So basically I was
art
asking...
books without an ISBN
without
number.
an ISBN number. I didn't know that in North America they have this huge, and also South America, have this huge tradition and this huge discussion, because there is not a history like in Europe that the communities, the government, and also private people give money to produce publications. So they were actually the founder of fanzines that comes from America. And by showing this expression, putting a no in front of the ISBN, I created a kind of, let's say, synonym where people started reflecting on. And when I went back home, I got about 500 books sent over to my studio. So I was really surprised. Even the postman was surprised. And that brought me back to the question, okay, what does it actually mean to produce without an ISBN number? Which what we called in the past the gray literature. So that was stuff which was not produced by a publishing house. There were no editors, so everything was done by the people, by the authors themselves.
And then we, in 2019, around July, there was a second, when we were putting the first iteration of this show, we thought maybe it's a good idea to do an Arabic edition of No ISBN in order to also kind of understand what is the gray literature that exists in the region, and to have, to put this open call out and to see what comes back. And so this was an interesting experience for all of us to see what kind of books we get back in response to this call, but also you never just exhibit them, like you create a sculpture out of it. And
Yes.
I don't know. This is the English. This is the first poster.
This was the first poster, yes, and then I think there is the second one. I was really happy about the invitation to do that for the Arabic world, because it's a new world for me. And it's very different, also in the tradition of printing and bookmaking, and the relation to artistic.
And also the language.
And also the language, yeah. I think there's a real, it's a really new world.
But you also got a lot of
It takes 1 minute.
a lot of books from the Arab world that were in English or in French. So it's not. You also get a glimpse into like that the languages used in this region or by artists are not just Arabic. That you get different kind of languages, like the books that came back to us.
So you will see some images from the exhibition in Beirut. We got about 200, I think, back.
I don't know.
No, this is the wrong. This was at the art institution. So we got about 200 books sent back from actually all over the Arabic world. It was really interesting material, also things you won't find. Some were published with a publishing house or an institution, but the most was self-published in terms of no ISBN, but also self-made.
I think what was interesting in this installation also, when people came to visit the show and they realized that they have publications that could be within this, this collection, and they would remind us sometimes, or like they remind themselves also, and like mention to us, and the work of so and so, and it was really a very interesting moment of kind of undocumented cataloging, let's say, of such practices in the Arab world, where we're just like coming to see the examples of others and just realizing that you're part of a larger community. And this is what we're trying to do in the different iterations of this show, is basically identify who's like us, since we have this publishing initiative, كيفتا, and it's an independent initiative, and so we do like many struggle to get an ISBN number or partner with others who would with like institutional partners that would overshadow us or other or do.
This was the invitation for Beirut.
But from all of this, we were also interested in translating your book, which no ISBN, and in which you have done a lot of like a huge survey of the topic of the practices and of the histories that had led to the emergence of such practices. So maybe you tell us a bit about the book, and just we're working to have this book ready by like in first week of February. And in Arabic, but it's already ready in English. But come back later, in like other days, to find copies of it here in the bookshop.
Mm-hmm. Well, then the publication was first published in 2016, and its focus on the on different things. First of all, it shows in the beginning a register of all the publications which I collected until the point where I started with the publication. So this is about 3,000 objects. And then I was, in the publication, I tried to construct something which is a mix between information, but also discussion, interviews, essays, the relation also to literature and music, and focusing on different questions which had to do with the history of bookmaking on one side, but also with the future, which means the relation between analog and digital publishing nowadays.
Yes. So
there are several essays on different focus. Like to give one example, tactility is a more and more getting an important issue, not only in the art world, because people realize that we're working so much on screens nowadays that we lose actually the connection to those experiences, you know. And so there are different moments in the publication which tries to focus on a certain aspect. Also the idea of minorities presented using those kind of publishing to present their own interests.
Yeah, it's really has a great range of entry points to the subject, and also of speakers. Like there's like the interviews that you did and the essays, some written by artists who started like a book fair, or some written by different kind of producers of these independent publications from different angles. But I wanted also, this is the No ISBN installation in Beirut.
Mm-hmm.
You will see, so Bernhard always also works in a very site-specific way. So when this project came here to Warehouse, he envisioned, he looks at the space, he thinks of what does it mean to walk through the space and how to reflect on that and react. So he made a different installation for this project here in Warehouse. And also the other work that you're presenting here, these two tapestries. But it's not your only work in textile. So I'm interested to know, like, what's your interest in textile? And then if you can tell us a bit about the work that's here.
Well, I think I was always interested in the material of textile, because when I started studying, I realized that it had a very bad reputation. So what we called textile art in Europe was the only thing you shouldn't do as an artist. So by looking at the material and by finding out different options and even using them, I thought it's a great medium to link, to discuss, but also to produce new expressions out of the work itself. But to give you one example, because you will see some images here, which is related to books. I realized in 2010, so after doing this for 3 years in my studio, that a lot of books were stolen. And by the fact that I had to pay all those publications to the authors, I became kind of mad, and I just thought, okay, I'm going to use all this experience for new works. So I decided to weave the memory of those covers and to reproduce them in a different way. So I made about 56 different small tapestries made in Shakaar Technique, which came out actually from the fact that they were stolen from my studio.
Yeah, and that work was also exhibited in Beirut. But it's the same technique, the Shakaar technique that's used for the tapestries here. So maybe you tell us a little bit what's special about this technique, and then also about this work.
Well, what interests me in Shakaar Technique, I do those myself. I have a manufactory in France, which is normally only producing for fashion, but I met them, and because I know how to do it, they asked me to come over and to produce it there. And maybe you know Shakaar, he was an engineer in the late 18th century, and he constructed the first machine to produce tapestries automatic with a machine, which was very, very much work before. I mean, you have a tradition in carpets, in weaving, in the different ways of knitting as well. But I was also interested in the fact that he created a machine in which he constructed cartoons with a hole. So he actually was the founder of 0 and 1, and this does mean actually that this is what we call the computer today, because it was the basic information or the basic step he created just by creating the machine, you know. So he found a way to lift each single wire and to produce tapestry like that. And that's was an interesting moment for me to use this technology, because it's also, I mean, it's really related to our time, I think, and it will be even more in the future.
And the two tapestries here show like 3D scans of your studio space, right?
Well, they show what I was drawing from the 3D scans, because you can't weave directly a 3D scan, but I was working to create a certain aesthetic which is in between a drawing and a photography. It shows basically two sides of the studio.
And it's the first time that you exhibit them, right?
It's the first time. So it's also interesting for me.